Before I begin, I suggest you stop watching this video now and watch RMC's ZX81 video instead. Neil and Mark did a much better job. I'll give you 5 seconds to click on it now. Ah, you're still here. Okay. Well, you have been warned, but if the incompetence gets too much, a link to RMC's video is in the description. In 2020, I was finally able to get my hands on one of my holy grail vintage computers, the Sinclair ZX81. I'd been desperate to tick this box for years, not because of what the ZX81 is, rather because of what it did. The ZX81 was the follow-up to Sinclair's first mainstream home computer, the ZX80. By mainstream, I mean available fully assembled from the factory. That said, both the ZX80 and ZX81 were available in kit form for the more adventurous hobbyist, a tradition that started with Sinclair's very first hobbyist computer, the MK14 kit, released in 1977. With the ZX81, Sinclair was able to further reduce the ZX80's already low cost by consolidating many chips into one uncommitted logic array, also known as the ULA. Both the ZX80 and ZX81 were wildly successful. They could use a TV as a monitor and an inexpensive cassette recorder for data storage. They had QWERTY keyboards, of sorts, and used a dialect of the popular BASIC programming language that was optimised to make the best use of the standard 1 kilobyte of RAM on offer. The ZX81 was also cheap. In Australia, the ZX81 sold for $199. Bear in mind, this was when competitors such as the Commodore VIC-20 and Tandy TRS-80 Coco were selling for much higher prices. I suspect that the big advertising spend played a large role in getting the ZX81 into major Australian retailers, as well as into one of Australia's largest specialist electronics chains, Dick Smith Electronics. The ZX81 sold around 1.5 million units worldwide during its production run from 1981 until July 1984. Sadly, it's not known how many of these made it to Australia. One thing that does seem clear is that there were enough ZX80s and ZX81s sold to warrant the formation of user groups down under, along with the dedication of many inches of column space in local computer mags. But that was then, and this is now. This here is a Sinclair ZX81, which is probably kind of obvious if you can read and if you know even a tiny bit about computers. It's the 40th anniversary of the ZX81's release this year in 2021. I think it's actually a really, to this day, I still think it's one of the all-time greats because it was the first truly affordable computer. If you've never seen a ZX81 in real life before, the first thing that'll strike you is just how tiny it is. That's a 7-inch LCD TV there, and you can see that the TV is a bit of a chonker compared to the ZX81. And my big hand, not that it's massive, but it's not exactly Trump-sized, but you can see that my hand spans right across that. So you can see just how small the ZX81 is. But if you want more perspective, here's my ZX Spectrum. In the original patent diagrams and prototype stage, this was referred to as a ZX82, so that should give you a clear picture of Sinclair's vision for how the microcomputer was going to evolve in the early 80s. At the moment, this ZX81 is effectively a display piece, and it will return to my collection as a display piece, mainly because it's not really very useful at the moment. It powers up, but the RF modulators in the ZX81 were a little bit problematic, as in they just don't play nicely with modern TVs, even modern TVs that have an analog tuner. I think you can see the problem with the RF modulator, and it doesn't get much better when I try tuning it in. In fact, that's the wrong button. But if you go back and try doing that again, that is as good as I can get it on this TV. So what this means is in order to use this ZX81 as anything other than a sexy ornament for the desk, we need to fit some sort of composite mod to it. Now there are a few options in terms of composite mods for the ZX81, ranging from a simple transistor setup soldered straight into the RF modulator with maybe a resistor or two, right through to slightly more advanced setups with things that'll try and amplify the picture and just give it, I guess, as much compatibility with modern screens as possible. So guess what I'll be doing? I will be going with the latter. This mod is known as the ZX2020, available from ZX Renew for around $25 dues. According to the documentation, it's a hybrid of two existing ZX81 composite mods, one of which being from the original zx.zig.net mod. Why did I choose the ZX2020 over cheaper options? Well, it promises to take the ZX81's somewhat weedy stock video output and turn it into something nice and beefy. For maximum compatibility with modern LCD TVs, the ZX2020 provides a switchable back porch and a couple of pots for adjustment, useful for early machines but lacked a back porch. As for what a back porch is, I had to Google it. Turns out that it's part of the sync information contained in the horizontal blanking period of analog video output, along with a front porch, horizontal pulse, and colour burst. From what I can gather, the original ZX81 ULA's video output contained only a front porch and horizontal pulse. This was sufficient to generate a picture on a black and white TV, but some colour TV struggled to make a usable picture without the back porch. To improve compatibility with colour TVs, the last of the ZX81 ULAs, the 2C210E, includes a back porch in its video signal. I bought this board ages ago and have been sitting on it for a while. Since then, a new version has been released which is a drop-in replacement for the RF modulator. If I did this conversion again, I'd use this version instead, as it would have saved me a bit of time and self-inflicted frustration, which will become apparent as the video goes on. When cracking open a ZX81, there are three really important things to bear in mind. The first thing is that 3 of the screws are located underneath rubber feet, being this foot, this foot, and this foot. The second thing to bear in mind is screwdriver size. A big chonker like that is not going to work, so you're going to need something a little bit more petite. And the third thing, you'll see what that third thing is in a moment. 2 short screws go up front, 3 long ones go up the back. That's just as much for my own reference as anybody else's in case I get stuck a bit later on. Now getting back to that third point, when opening up a ZX81, be really super careful because the keyboard membrane, particularly the ribbon cable, will evaporate if you so much as look at it the wrong way. So much so that unless you're living in the UK and you can get a replacement membrane very quickly, I would just buy a spare membrane and just have it on hand, because you know, you don't want to start on a project with a ZX81 and then be stopped just even before you really get a chance to begin because you've got to wait 3 weeks for a membrane to come in from overseas. So definitely keep a spare one there. If you're really careful, you might just get away with using the existing membrane and then you've got one in the parts bin, because like every other Sinclair computer, there are 2 types of ZX81s in the world. There are ones with broken membranes and ones that are going to have broken membranes. So let's see which category this one falls into. Okay, now this is the first time I've ever looked inside a ZX81, so I wasn't expecting a couple of extra screws here, but no biggie. No, and these ones look a touch skinnier than the 2 front external screws, so you're going to have a fun time trying to work out what's going on here. So you want to be really careful not to get your screws mixed up, otherwise you'll be screwed. This is the moment of truth. Can I disconnect this ZX81's keyboard without ending up with a bunch of flaky, powdery plastic in my hands? Ooh, okay. Ooh. I reckon I heard that give way. Close, so close. Let's have a look. That's the tiniest of tiniest cracks you can see right there. whether or not that's going to be a deal breaker for when that... Ooh, yeah. It was a good attempt, if I do say so myself. I think I did well, but yeah. So let's have a look at this one quickly before I do anything of any consequence. This looks like a very late ZX81. My understanding is that they were in production from 1981 until about the end of 83, I believe. And this one's definitely one of the later models, as the chips, they all date to 83. The ULA dates to the 9th week of 83. The RF modulator dates to the 29th week of 83. And the CPU's 21st week of 83. So really, this is telling me it's probably mid-83 model. There's your whacking great big F-off 1 kilobyte of RAM in that chip there. There are mods to upgrade the ZX81 to 16K of RAM and beyond on board. In fact, there are some mods that'll push it as far as 32 and possibly even 64K. I don't happen to have a spare suitable RAM chip on hand, so I'll just persevere with what I've got now, along with the wobbly external 16K expansion. And to eliminate any doubt about this being one of the last of the ZX81s, this is an issue 3 board. These days, as part of any sort of resto or recap or whatever that I do with a machine that has a 7805 DC-DC converter in it, I will drop one of these in here, which is a Traco Power TSR1-2450, a drop-in switching DC-DC converter. The 7805 is a linear DC-DC converter, and of course the tricky part with linear converters is that they do generate an absolute ton of heat. Taking the 7805 out means that we can get rid of this heatsink, which in turn will cool the machine down, therefore perhaps reducing the need to put heatsinks on any of these chips here, and it'll also allow me to install this board right there. So it'll have great access to everything that's required in order to make it do. Something to be mindful of when changing the DC-DC converter over is making sure that you get the input and output pins absolutely correct. That's your input, that's your ground, and that's your 5V output. On the Traco replacement, they've very helpfully marked the input with a little dot. So you want to make sure that the little dot goes there. So that should be a pretty straightforward replacement. Now that I've installed the new DC to DC converter, I thought I'd do a voiceover on this part just to hurry the video along a bit. Installation of the ZX2020 composite mod is relatively straightforward, assuming that you have the instructions. Bear in mind that the instructions are emailed from ZX Renew shortly after purchase, and they are not available for download from the ZX Renew website, so make sure you don't delete that email. I'd actually forgotten about this email as I'd bought the part months earlier, but after a bit of searching, I found the email and I went on my merry way. A nice touch is the inclusion of headers on the wires provided with this kit. That said, the wires were a bit on the short side for my application. Whilst the instructions call for drawing the 5V and ground from respective lines going into the RF modulator, I tapped directly into the DC-DC converter to enable installation of the mod under the keyboard. I already had to extend the wire going to the RCA output. I didn't feel like extending another 2 wires. There are a couple of spots to take video in from the ULA, either from the video in wire going straight into the RF, or by soldering a pin header a little bit closer to the ULA. Another option is to tap straight into ULA pin 16. The cleanest way to do this is by soldering a header pin on the south side of D9. This option is worth considering if you'd prefer the composite mod to be a little easier to reverse, which is why I did it this way. On issue 3 boards, D9 is unpopulated. I'm not sure if this is populated on earlier ZX81 boards, so your mileage may vary. To make the mod fit, I needed to bend the pin headers down to give enough clearance between the wires and the keyboard. If I had some right-angled header pins, I would have fitted those instead. Either way, I'd suggest bunching the wire ends up using a small cable tie or some blue tack to keep everything connected during reassembly. Now it'll just be a matter of doing a test fit where I want to put the board, which is just underneath the keyboard. So I'll need a ZX81 repair kit to hold that in place temporarily before, of course, we put double-sided tape on there. The main board itself is going to wobble about a bit, but that's not really a big deal. I just want to see how this is going to work, if in fact it's going to work, and what kind of result we're going to get. The moment of truth. Hey! I am freaking stoked that this ZX81 is going to be usable as soon as I put it back together. I ended up putting heat sinks on the CPU and the ULA because I happen to have a couple of heat sinks lying around. Whilst it's tempting to buy heat sinks with adhesive backing, they're not the best for thermal transfer. A more effective option is to buy heat sinks without an adhesive backing and use a good thermal cement to glue the heatsink to the chip. I use Star's 922 because it's cheap and effective. The only downside is that this needs at least 24 hours to cure. Ideally leave the board out on a flat surface during curing to ensure that the reinstallation of the board into the case doesn't make any of the heat sinks go a bit skew-whiff. This applies to all vintage computers, not just the ZX81. I was almost going to leave this part on the cutting room floor because I made some embarrassing schoolboy errors when removing the keyboard membrane, the most obvious of which being the failure to use a hairdryer or heat gun to gently melt the sticky membrane backing. Instead of making you suffer through several minutes of fumbling, along with some pontification over what happens when a hard surface comes into contact with a soft surface, I'm going to cut straight to the part where I realised I'd done goofed. You know how I was talking about how you've got to be careful with a hard surface yielding to a softer surface? That's what happens. So it's a little bit jaggedy now, but shite. Okay. I wish that hadn't happened. Okay, well, I reckon I can probably just file that very gently, and it's not going to be a disaster, but I think I'll just go to using my hands if I can. That's what the old membrane looks like when it's naked. Doesn't feel sticky, but I reckon what I'll do is I'll go the old 1-2 on it. I'll put a bit of eucalyptus oil on there and get rid of the stickiness, and then once that's done I'll wipe it down with some IPA just so it's got a nice clean surface, in order that the new membrane might do the best possible job of sticking. And I might even see if I can tidy that crap up while I'm at it. Well, that crisis was averted with a couple of bits of sandpaper. Firstly, I used a 180 grit to make the hole a little bit more bigger and a bit uniform. And then I finished it off with some 1200 wet dry, wet rubbed, just to finalise the bits on the edges. Now, the only thing you might notice in some lights is that the texture has come off, but that could just be 40 years worth of wear and tear. So not a big deal in the scheme of things. And yeah, not ideal. Would have preferred not to have gone and hacked into the plastic, but as you can see there, that's not terrible. If you can see in that light there, that's not awful. The more astute viewer may notice that I've just cranked up the exposure ever so slightly. This is in order to show a little bit better how to put this membrane back into the ZX81's case. So, see, cable feeds into there like so. I'm thinking the way to attack this would be to very gently remove the backing and then just try and get it as straight as possible. Now, before I do that, a test fit would suggest that doing so isn't going to be a massive issue because this does fit really well. So it's not impossible, but it's going to be quite difficult to stuff this up. I hope I haven't jinxed myself by saying that, but I guess we'll see what happens. Seems like a good place to start. Now, I suspect this is a lot like putting a screen protector on a mobile phone or a tablet, in that you don't want to get any dust in it, and you know, you only really get one shot at it. So yeah, no pressure. It appears to be on straight, although the gaps are a little bit uneven. The gap on the left-hand side is slightly narrower than that on the right-hand side. It's only a couple of mil though, it's not really a big deal. And like I said before, it's possible that stuff came out the Sinclair factory looking a little bit skewy around the edges from time to time as well. So again, not a big deal. There we go, let's see how that compares to the old one. So yep, you can see the new one's a little bit brighter. Whether or not that's just because there's 40 years less, or 38 years in this case, less worth of grime on there, or whether it's the new ones are brighter anyway, I don't know, but that's looking pretty schmick, I reckon. This ZX81 probably needs a bit more work to be its absolute best. Things such as an internal RAM upgrade, improving the cassette port's reliability, and a recap would finish things off just nicely. That said, I have a ton of other projects, either in progress or in the pipeline, that are a bit more pressing, so I'll just have to pop the ZX81 back on the shelf for now. It still works better than it did when I first got it, so that's a result as far as I'm concerned. Until next time, see you later.